Kia ora, time for our New Zealand Sporting History segment. We do it each Thursday. We really look forward to it. And sometimes it's finding out more about a sporting event we're all familiar with. Sometimes it's going deep on one we hadn't really considered. And Michael Clark joins us for the second time back in the Auckland studio. He's a motor racing historian, and he's going to help us dig into the history of a pretty iconic event, the New Zealand Grand Prix. First held in 1950 at the Ohakea Circuit in Palmerston North. These days it's the signature event of the Formula Regional Oceania Championship, and many famous and iconic drivers have taken part in the New Zealand Grand Prix over the years, from international stars like Sir Jackie Stewart to local legends like Bruce McLaren and Amon and Nick Cassidy. Well, Michael has authored books about the careers of several Kiwi drivers, including Denny Holm and Amon. He's also the chairman of the Bruce McLaren Trust and trustee of the Kiwi Driver Fund, and he joins me now. Hi.
Jesse, nice to be back.
Great to chat to you. I know we're talking history, but are you excited about Liam Lawson in Formula One?
Absolutely. It is meant that Formula One and motor racing generally has been opened up to a whole bunch of new people who I never imagined would ever be talking motor racing with me. I got an email from my optometrist the morning after the US Grand Prix. He's been my optometrist for 30 years. And so he dropped me a line. I mean, it has just provided people... people know my wife goes into the local shops. They know of my interest in motor racing. They're talking motor racing now with my wife. So it is it's extraordinary what one person can do for a sport. And Liam is just at the start of a journey. People thought when he got to Formula One, oh, great, he's made it. Well, no, this is just the start. And but he is already showing that he's got a lot of the ingredients. I'm tempted to say all the ingredients, but we don't know yet. As I've been saying for many years, and I'll continue to say, no one knows how good someone's going to be in Formula One until they're in Formula One.
Gosh.
And there's so much to happen. And like any sport, it's one thing is having the natural ability. The natural ability is just the ticket to get you in the door. It's whether or not you can handle the pressure. And there's the pressure on the paddock or the field or the track, depending on the sport, and then there's the pressure that happens off. And so...
No shortage of that in Formula One, particularly the team he's in.
Well, precisely that. So it's a pressure cooker, and it's how well he's going to deal with that pressure cooker. So far, so good.
Plenty of people love motor racing, but most people keep it to watching whatever's going to happen over the weekend. Can you tell me about your passion for motor racing history, where that comes from, and where you got interested in stuff that happened before you were born or too early in your life for you to remember?
I don't know. I
wish more guests would answer like that.
My dad was interested in cars, but not motor racing. He took me to car racing. My aunt used to take me to Grand Prix. So I was fortunate that there were people that realised that I had this emerging obsession as an 8-year-old when I first went to the New Zealand Grand Prix. And I can remember my dad going to school interviews when I was in Form 1, and my Form 1 teacher saying to Dad, yeah, but does he read? It's important that he reads. And Dad said, yeah, he reads, but all he ever does is read about racing cars. And the response, and I've never forgotten, was, well, that's good that he's reading. He'll eventually grow out of motor racing. When's
that going to happen?
It hasn't even come close.
Okay. Is 1950 where the story of the New Zealand Grand Prix begins?
Sort of, yeah. 1950 is when the first race that was called a Grand Prix was held on the airfield at Ohakea. And then in 1954, it got a bit serious, and there was a Grand Prix held at Ardmore that people now remember as the New Zealand Grand Prix, but it wasn't called the New Zealand Grand Prix at the time. Unbelievably, the first Grand Prix to carry the New Zealand Grand Prix tag was in 1956, but the program for that event refers to the 1954 race as the first New Zealand Grand Prix. So almost as though Ohakea in 1950 sort of got airbrushed out of history. But in terms of international players, 1954 was the first time there were visiting drivers from Europe, from Australia, and it's never stopped.
Yeah, and why was it started up here? Just because of the local interest in motor racing and the desire to be part of that circuit?
Yeah, I mean we're a car orientated country, and there's been racing happening in New Zealand. It started on Muriwai Beach and probably started other places, but certainly on Muriwai Beach back in the early 20s. So it was always going to happen. It was just a matter of where it could happen. And one of the things which the Americans left us after the Second World War was airfields, Ardmore being an ideal place.
Right.
I mean, it's one of those extraordinary things that people wonder, how is it that England ended up being the centre of world motor racing? And it always has been and probably always will be. I mean, it's perfectly positioned in Europe and et cetera, et cetera. But part of the reason why England in particular became such a nerve centre of motor racing was because they've got all these circuits that have been largely, a lot of them, constructed on RAF airfields. If it hadn't been for Hitler, those airfields wouldn't have needed to have existed. So, I mean, it's an irony, but that's really how cottage industries in the UK turned into mega businesses in years to come.
What would the cars have been like back in the 50s?
Well, they were almost always front-engined. They had virtually nothing approaching safety equipment. Roll bar, even roll hoops over the driver's head were still the best part of 20 years into the future, certainly ones that were extended above the driver's helmet. And so injuries were frequent, fatalities occurred occasionally, and that seemed to be all part of what was accepted as being what motor racing was all about. I mean, it would be completely and utterly unacceptable today, but in those days, I suppose in the aftermath of World War II, racing drivers became like Spitfire pilots. I mean, they were essentially expendable. One driver goes out, doesn't come back, just like a Spitfire pilot, so you just put another one in. There was always a willing lineup of young men wanting to jump into racing cars.
Was it popular with the public?
Well, it was enormously popular, and there were all sorts of stories at the time, most of which I don't believe, because I don't imagine anyone could ever have known the accuracy, but it all made for good headlines to say there were 70,000 people turned up at Ardmore for this year's Grand Prix, etc. Well, no one had any idea because no one expected that there would be numbers of that sort. So I'm not sure how accurate those numbers were, but it was enormously popular and continued to draw huge crowds right till the end of Ardmore, and then at the end of 1962, the Ohakea Circuit was constructed, and I mean that only closed 2 years ago, or not even that. So Ardmore became Ohakea for the 1963 Grand Prix, and so that continued as a very much a South Auckland orientated facility.
So like the population in the 20th century, it all sort of drifted north, ended up in Auckland. And I mean, do we say that New Zealand's motoring talent flourished because of the Grand Prix, or that we actually got interested in having a Grand Prix because of the motoring talent that we had?
No, the talent flourished because there was a Grand Prix.
Really?
It became an opportunity for drivers to be measured against the internationals, and the key internationals, particularly of the late 50s, were Stirling Moss and Jack Brabham. Well, then when Bruce McLaren was thrown into the mix, the media got hold of this term, the eternal triangle. The three of them each year would be the three key names for each Grand Prix who was going to win. And
you say those names again?
Jack Brabham, who was world champion 3 times, Stirling Moss, who was never world champion, but one of the absolute all-time greats in everybody's top 10 list, and Bruce McLaren. And so the young Bruce McLaren really achieved what he did and got recognised because of what he was able to do and impress observers in the New Zealand Grand Prix. So out of the New Zealand Grand Prix came a thing called the Driver to Europe scheme, backed by the New Zealand International Grand Prix Association. And the Driver to Europe was little more than a ticket. It sounded glorious, but it was little more than an airline ticket to get a driver to England. And from there, they did what they could. You're on your own, but we'll get you that far. And so in 1958, it was Bruce McLaren. In 1960, it was George Lawton and Denny Hulme. and so it continued for a few more years. So, I mean, I remember Chris Amon saying to me once that he would never have got as into Formula One as quickly as he did had he been born in England and competing in the Midlands or wherever. But because he was in New Zealand, even though he was in what was at the time an antique compared with the front-running cars, he was at least on a grid with Stirling Moss, with Jack Brabham, with John Surtees and Bruce McLaren
here
at Ardmore.
Yeah.
And so he was able to demonstrate what he was capable of. More importantly, he wasn't just demonstrating to the crowd or to the other drivers. There were visiting team owners who were out here with their cars, and young Chris Amon was spotted as an 18-year-old. And so he got opportunities that wouldn't have happened had we not had a New Zealand Grand Prix.
Emma's been in touch on text. Jesse, regarding motor racing history in New Zealand, my dad, Theo Stanton, was the mechanic manager with the Driver to Europe scheme in 1960. They couldn't choose one driver, so George Lawton and Denny Holm both went. Sadly, George Lawton was killed at Roskilde Ring in Denmark on the tour. And Dad told us lots of fantastic stories of the Kiwis taking on the worlds. Awesome to see Liam Lawson in the Formula One today. That's a nice message, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Theo Stanton absolutely was essential to that whole 1960 trip, because with two drivers, they needed someone to organise and manage them. So, yeah, he was the man.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for getting in touch. And so, fair to say, no disrespect, but the New Zealand Grand Prix doesn't have the same sort of worldwide name recognition, perhaps, as the Australian Grand Prix or the Monaco Grand Prix or the
Quite right.
British Grand Prix.
They're part of the World Championship.
Yeah.
And,
so was there a time when our Grand Prix was at that same level?
No, we've never been part of the World Championship. In fact, New Zealand and Macau, I think I'm correct in saying, are the only two places in the world that still are able to carry the term Grand Prix.
Really?
Grand Prix's become very much a Formula One World Championship thing. So because we'd always had a Grand Prix, as had Macau, we're allowed to continue to use the term Grand Prix, even though it's not for Formula One or the World Championship. If Costa Rica or Norway, for example, two countries that have never had a Formula One race or a Grand Prix, wanted to now call their local race not part of the World Championship, not part of Formula One, just a local race, the Norwegian Grand Prix, bad luck. But we had one since 1950 or 54 or 56, whichever date you want to believe. And as a result of that, it's an enduring title, which we are very proud of.
And when did it peak? When was it its most famous?
Well, I would say during the Tasman series and the late 60s would be when we had the most international drivers coming. Every year, Jesse, we would have part of the Formula One grid and part of the sharp end of the Formula One grid. Jim Clark, Denny Holm, Bruce McLaren, Chris Amon, Pedro Rodriguez, here in New Zealand competing. And
why would they come all the way down here if it wasn't part of the World Championship?
It was a place to come in the summer. It's quite cold in Scotland in January. So it was a nice place to come. There was the teams were welcome and sent their cars here. And there was a championship. The Tasman Championship was a big deal. It was probably behind Formula One the next most significant championship for open-wheeler racing cars.
Multi-race?
Yes, it started always at Pukekohe or sometimes at Levin. So 4 races in New Zealand. It would be Pukekohe, Levin, Wigram just outside of Christchurch, Tauratonga just outside of Invercargill, and then it head off for 4 races in Australia. Surfers Paradise, Warwick Farm in Sydney, Sandown just out of Melbourne, and somewhere else, maybe after Tasmania and then later on to Adelaide. So it was a big deal.
So give us some iconic races or race moments from the New Zealand Grand Prix over the years. But by the way, I'm talking to Michael Clark. This is our New Zealand Sporting History segment.
Well, I suppose my first memory, Jesse, would be a race that is very dear to my heart because it was the first time I arrived at a Grand Prix with an autograph book. It was the second time I'd gone to the Grand Prix, 1968. I'm 9.5 years old. And before the race, I got the autographs of all those names I just mentioned, every one of them. I didn't think I was going to find Jim Clark. I couldn't find him anywhere. And eventually, just before he got into his car, I handed him an autograph book, and he must have looked at this little 9-year-old boy thinking, poor little chap's got Parkinson's already. My hands were shaking so much. So that day, Chris Amon won the Grand Prix. Chris Amon would go on in years and years to come. Little did I know when I got his autograph sitting on the back tyre of his Ferrari about an hour before the race. Little did I know that in years to come he and I would become very close friends. But sitting watching that race, no one would have known the irony in January 1968 of Chris Amon inheriting a race win in a Ferrari from a retiring Lotus of Jim Clark. Jim Clark had led the race. His car broke down. Chris Amon went on to win. Boy, if that could have happened more in Formula One, because Chris unfortunately had a very poor run of luck in Formula One and retired so often with a broken Ferrari. So here he was winning a race with a reliable Ferrari. So that was a very memorable day, not just because of the race, but because of what happened beforehand for me. Other races, into the 70s, there was Kenny Smith, the first resident New Zealander to win the Grand Prix in 1976, and that was a highly memorable day. And then in 1983, my very close friend David Oxton winning is something which I always remember sitting. It's one of those, where were you at that time? I can probably still see the grandstand seat I was sitting in to watch that particular race.
I don't know that name, David Oxton.
David Oxton, a legend of New Zealand motor racing, raced for a long time, a long and successful career, and his career is being celebrated by the New Zealand Grand Prix Club at a big meeting at Hampton Downs at the end of January. So it's nice that the club recognises heroes of years gone by. Earlier this year they recognised Graham Lawrence, who was 1970 Tasman champion. Last year they recognised Jim Palmer. So it's a neat thing they do to highlight a driver's career and what his contribution has been to our sport.
Why did that Tasman championship drop off?
It's a very good question. It is fair to say that the championship very much existed because of the uniform agreement on the types of cars that would be run by both the Australians and the New Zealanders. At the end of 1975, there was a bit of a parting of the ways. They went one direction, we went another direction. And so, sadly, the Tasman Championship was no more. It was one of those great things while it lasted, but it didn't endure.
Someone told me on text that Chris Amon's wife has just died.
Yeah, I'm off to the funeral tomorrow, in Palmerston North, in Bulls, in fact. So, yes, she passed away on Monday.
Okay, commiserations to the family. Was it a big deal when that Pukekohe racetrack opened?
Yeah, well, yes. The big deal really was that there was a replacement for Ardmore. I mean, Ardmore was getting busier as an airport, so it was only a matter of time before Ardmore needed to be replaced. But the end came very quickly. So with a lot of haste, Pukekohe was discovered as an opportunity after a lot of other options were considered. It was built around the outside of a horse racing track. That had been done before. Aintree in the north of England, Warwick Farm, as I mentioned before, just outside of Sydney. So it wasn't the first time that car racing and horse racing had combined on the same facility. So, yeah, a big deal because it effectively provided a venue in Auckland, which was so important for the Tasman series, and a new home for the Grand Prix.
So you're talking about 70s as being the heyday of the New Zealand Grand Prix. What happened through the 80s, 90s and beyond? Well,
through the 80s, I mean, we still had a Grand Prix. I mean, we've pretty much always, I think there's a couple of years when the Grand Prix didn't run, but we've pretty much always had a Grand Prix.
But at some point, the big Northern Hemisphere names stopped coming.
They did, and they stopped coming because Formula One's season expanded. So instead of the first round of Formula One starting after the Tasman series finished, there started to be coming the South American rounds of the Formula One World Championship. So I guess we always assumed that the big names had been coming. Why wouldn't they continue to come? Well, they could only come if they were available. Formula One became bigger, more rounds of the championship, and so those rounds clashed with the Tasman series. So the big names stopped coming as big names. The big names still come, just that we've got to wait a few years for them to become a big name. So, I mean, Liam Lawson wasn't a big name when he was running in New Zealand, and so many other drivers on the current Formula One grid. There's an Argentinian called Colapinto at the moment who's all the rage all of a sudden. And no one knew he was going to be a big name when he was here in New Zealand a few years ago. Now he is. So
I keep thinking of the ASB Classic like that, this sort of summer event here in New Zealand. Gets squeezed by the professional calendar where you see people on the way up, or I guess possibly on the way down. That probably happens less with motor racing. But yeah, you go along and you don't know who you're going to see, but who knows what they might become.
That is very much the case. And so we go along to the Grand Prix these days, or the Toyota Racing Series, and which is part of the New Zealand Grand Prix is for those cars. And you look and wonder, who from this grid, who am I seeing who I might be hearing about again in a Formula One seat in a few years' time? And sometimes who you think you might be seeing is not actually who makes it.
Why did Pukekohe close?
Well, the horse racing situation changed. They owned the land. They needed the property. So those many years where the two disciplines coexisted very comfortably alongside one another, unfortunately came to an end. It's some people had mixed feelings. Pukekohe was a place that I was once told you never have a small accident at, and so it was. Yeah.
Was there a big accident that year you were talking about in '68?
There was a big accident in '72. Yeah, that was the only fatality in the entire running of the New Zealand Grand Prix was in 1972. Well, it was a freak accident which involved, would you believe, a train that was running along the North Island Main Trunk Railway line, which runs parallel to the back straight of Pukekohe. Look, the long and short of it, Jesse, is that a very promising young driver from Levin called Brian Falloon was killed, and another well-known New Zealand driver, I mentioned him a little while ago, Graham Lawrence. His career was honoured by the Grand Prix Club earlier this year. Graham Lawrence was terribly injured. The fact that he got back into a racing car is amazing. The fact that he came back and 3 years later was a contender for the Tasman Championship of 1975, as it turns out the last Tasman Championship, is remarkable. So, yeah, it was a very, very sad day.
I mean, you don't need to give me all the gruesome details, but what did the train have to do with it?
Well, the train was there, and the train got hit by one of the cars that was involved in the collision. It
just happened to be passing at the time.
Yeah, well, I think the train had slowed, or was maybe even stationary, so people could see what was going on the track. I can't remember the details. It's a long time ago, while I was there, that part of it I've tried to remove from my memory, but partly because I was a bit of a fan of Brian Falloon, and it was a terribly sad day.
So what is the status of the New Zealand Grand Prix now?
Well, it's healthy, it's strong, it's part of the as I said before, well, it's got a new name, but I still call it the Toyota Racing Series, and it is it's a coveted title to win. I mean, if you win the New Zealand Grand Prix, your name is being put on a cup that has Sterling Moss's name on it, Jack Brabham's name. And for the kids who win it these days, I mean, the next winner of the New Zealand Grand Prix is probably now 17 or 18, or the Grand Prix is going to be run in January, February. So in a few months' time, that winner will probably be 17 or 18 years of age. These names will mean maybe nothing to them now, but when they look at that cup in years to come and think my name sits alongside some of the greatest racing drivers that have ever lived, that is a significant thing. So when they come to New Zealand for the 2025 New Zealand Toyota Racing Series, there are a few goals. One of them is to win the championship, and the other is to win the New Zealand Grand Prix. So it's still a big deal.
Where is it held now?
Well, it's an extremely good question. It's moved around the place, and Gosh, I actually don't know the answer to that.
Right.
I don't know where it's going to be in 2025. It's been in recent years Hampton Downs. It's been at Manfield. I think it might be at Highlands, but I don't know for certain.
Are they looking for a permanent home, or is this
No,
the
I
idea now?
think it has been. It's been a moving. I think it's actually not a bad thing to move it around. It actually, Australians always used to move it around. It never stayed in one place for year after year. When it was prior to it becoming part of the World Championship in 1985.
You're right, Highlands. Well done.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a guess.
And what are they racing?
Well, it'll be those Toyota-powered cars, the FT60s, and they are all identical, so it makes for extremely close racing, and it really shows cream rising to the top. And as part of the Kiwi Driver Fund, we're hoping we can find some money so that we can help put some Kiwis into cars.
Sorry to interrupt you. What's the Kiwi Driver Fund?
Well, the Kiwi Driver Fund is exactly that. It is a fund that my good friend Bob McMurray chairs, who is a well-known New Zealand motor racing personality, and we try to find the money to get Kiwi drivers into that category to then give them a leg up onto the world stage. So it's it's tough. And there's a few foundations around at the moment of people who help. I mean, Colin Giltrap, Tony Quinn, and now the Roden people have all started assisting, which is marvellous to see, because it's not a cheap sport, and it is a way of helping people. I mean, Liam Lawson doesn't come from a wealthy family, so he has got there purely on talent, which in itself is a story.
And no doubt a bit of support as well.
A huge amount of support. I mean, he's done it with support and talent.
And presumably Formula One isn't the only destination for these kids.
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, the alternative, and it's the route that Marcus Armstrong, who is really had to some extent a bit of a parallel path up the ladder to Liam. He peeled off into the Indianapolis Indy racing scene, and I was at Indianapolis earlier in the year and saw him compete in his first Indy 500, and that is a terrifying but incredibly exhilarating experience to think what those guys do around a circuit that looks very simple, but it is so dangerous and so difficult. So it is that's the other part of an ultimate form of motor racing.
I'm kind of envious of how much passion you have for the sport and how much you must love showing up trackside to see some of these events.
Well, you become obsessed with things sometimes, and this just happens to be my obsession.
Good stuff. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
This has been New Zealand Sporting History, and we've been talking about the New Zealand Grand Prix. I hope you learnt a bit about 70 years of that race, including some real highlights in the 60s and 70s, but still going strong and still providing some plenty of action. February 2025, Highlands Motorsport Park will be the next one.